feet wide at the top. There was a very real concern as to whether or not a dam this thin could hold back the enormous pressure of a 5-mile-long lake. Its strength would come from the design and shape of its arch. The workers went home for the winter. As soon as it was possible, Brown rode into Bear Valley the following spring. He was greeted by the sight of a new lake where lush green meadows and tall pine forest had set just 1 year earlier. Frank Brown had created the largest man-made lake in the world at a cost of just $75,000. The next year, on July 10, 1885, the floodgates were opened and water started flowing down Bear Creek to grateful Redlands farmers. The narrow rock dam was safe and would continue to hold strong for over 20 years. In 1885, an unusually heavy winter filled the new lake to capacity, drowning over 9,000 trees. During the winter months after the lake had frozen over, loggers would go out into the ice and cut the trees off at the water line and let them fall onto the ice. In spring, after the lake had thawed, the logs would be towed by boats to a lumber mill near the village. A log boom was built just east of the dam to protect it from debris. There were thousands of stumps left in the lake. Some were just below the water line, and for the next 50 years, these stumps would pose a danger to boaters.
There are a lot of tragedies caused by the trees in the lake. In the early days of the lake, they had a tendency to use some very light boats up here. There were sailboats about 18 feet long, and they were primarily built out of laths and covered with canvas. And if you were skating along in one of these boats and hit a snag, it would rip the bottom out. Two Talmadge brothers were out duck hunting one fall, and a squall came up and forced their boat into one of these snags, which ripped the bottom of it out, and both of the boys were drowned.
A house was built on the south side of the lake for the dam keeper who handled the maintenance on the dam and regulated the flow of water to Redlands.
Shortly after the dam was completed in 1884, a log cabin was built at the site where the present dam keeper's house is. However, this only lasted about 3 years and burned. In 1894, it was decided to build a rock house, and that is the house that sits there today.
Over the years, this famous rock house above the lake has fallen into disrepair from abuse and neglect. A move is currently underway with the Bear Valley Historical Society and other Big Bear residents to save this building and have it declared a historical site. Big Bear Lake was stocked with 10,000 trout in 1887. It immediately became a magnet for fishermen and vacationers. Each summer would find people camped all around the lake. But getting to Big Bear was a 2-day trek over roads that should have been called trails. The most direct route into Big Bear was from Redlands, by burro on a steep trail up the Santa Ana Canyon, then over the South Ridge via Bluff Lake and Cedar Lake before dropping down into Bear Valley. The only other route was over the Cajon Pass, through the Mojave Desert, then up the Cushenberry Grade, now known as Highway 18, to the north side of the valley through the mining town of Doble near Baldwin Lake. In 1888, local Bear Valley ranchers Gus Knight Jr. and John Metcalf realized the potential for a resort and decided to do something about it. They purchased 80 acres on the south side of the lake and built a small hotel that could sleep about 30 people. By June of that year, their Bear Valley Hotel was fully booked for the summer. Tents were needed to handle the overflow of guests. The Bear Valley Hotel had a monopoly on the tourist trade for the next 10 years. However, Gus Knight wanted a direct wagon road to Big Bear. He appealed to the county supervisors, but they refused to allocate public funds for a road into the mountains. So, Knight took matters into his own hands, and in 1891 he incorporated the Bear Valley Wagon Road Company. He carved out a dirt road from Grout Creek, now Fawnskin, to Green Valley. Known as the Snowslide Road, it still exists today as U.S. Forest Service Road 2N13. From Green Valley, the road ran to Hunsaker Flat, now Running Springs, where it connected to the existing City Creek Toll Road. It was strictly a summertime road, subjected to occasional washouts by thunderstorms and closed permanently by winter snows, but it did allow vacationers to travel to Big Bear by wagon in only a day and a half. The toll road was an immediate success, and the Knight Metcalf Resort continued to prosper and expand.
But Knight's luck was about to take a turn for the worst. In 1900, on Christmas Eve night, the hotel burned to the ground. Gus Knight tried to rebuild, but due to financial consideration and problems that he ran into, he eventually had to sell out to his brother-in-law, Charles Henry. But in 1902, Knight lost the rest of his Big Bear Resort property due to bankruptcy. His father, Augustus, quietly bought back 40 of the acres that his son had lost in the bankruptcy. Then 4 years later, in 1906, Augustus died. The death of his father gave Gus Knight a fresh start.
Taking control of the 40 acres, he built a new resort called Knight's Camp. He built a general store, a dance pavilion, a boat landing, and eventually 40 cabins. The success of this camp enabled Knight to purchase additional land that he would eventually subdivide and sell. He sold the resort and retired in 1920, a wealthy man. The only other resort operating in Bear Valley during the early 1900s was Pine Knot Lodge. After Knight's bankruptcy, his old Bear Valley Hotel property was rebuilt as Pine Knot Lodge by a wealthy group from Redlands in 1906. No expense was spared, turning it into a major resort. They built a complex that included a main pavilion, a store, a post office, and 75 cabins. The lodge also operated a 30-foot motor launch and a fleet of rowboats for their guests. It was located just south of today's village on Pine Knot Boulevard, and the local community that sprang up around the lodge became known as Pine Knot. Years later, in 1938, residents of Pine Knot decided to officially change the name of their community to Big Bear Lake. It was also that year the Pine Knot Lodge was demolished.
The nationwide financial collapse of 1893 dealt a serious blow to the Bear Valley Land and Water Company. With financial considerations and projects going in other areas, they were forced into bankruptcy, and the fate of Big Bear Lake sat unresolved in the courts for the next 10 years. Then in 1903, a new group of farmers, headed by Herbert Garston, formed the Bear Valley Mutual Water Company. They paid off all the creditors and took control of the lake in 1909. It was then decided to raise the height of the dam to increase the holding capacity of the lake.
An engineer by the name of John Eastwood was asked to take a look at it. In April of 1910, John Eastwood submitted plans to the Board of Directors for the construction of a new 65-foot high dam. His unique design called for a series of concrete arches to be supported by massive concrete buttresses. It would be strong and cheaper to build than a normal gravity dam.
The Eastwood Dam was a very, very special design. It adopts the principle of thin wall construction using multiple arches. It was very low cost and it's extremely strong. Eastwood's concept was that the pressure of the lake water would force the dam down against its foundation. And he used buttresses that slope on the downstream side to reinforce the entire structure. It is a remarkably strong dam for its cost.
Plans were approved, and that summer construction started on the Eastwood Dam. It would be built about 50 yards downstream from the rock dam. Unlike the rock dam, which had been constructed using materials found locally, all of the materials for the Eastwood Dam had to be hauled from Victorville to Big Bear by wagon. Additional time and money had to be spent in an attempt to cut deep enough into the bedrock to get below potential leaks. A steam engine was hauled in and set up at the base of the rock dam to move the tons of concrete and steel that would be required. Once the foundation was securely attached to the granite bedrock, construction was started on the massive buttresses that would bear the full weight of the lake. As time went by, excitement grew as the concrete arches were added, and the final form of the dam began to take shape. By the time the dam was finished in 1912, it stood 72 feet high. In spite of everything, Eastwood finished his dam on schedule at a total cost of $138,000. 20 feet higher than the old rock dam, the Eastwood Dam increased the holding capacity of the lake by 3 times. However, the additional height of the dam flooded lands that the water company didn't own.
Apparently the survey was not quite accurate, and land was flooded that was not owned by the water company. And there was also some land that was owned by the forestry that was flooded. It wasn't completely solved because in a couple of instances there's still land that is flooded at the top level that doesn't belong to the water company.
In this scene, the old rock dam is about to disappear below the water line as the lake level is rising. The rock dam still stands there today, usually under about 20 feet of water. Since then, whenever the lake level drops far enough, the old rock dam becomes a popular spot for fishermen. The Eastwood Dam also created another unplanned surprise. Before construction ever started, Herbert Garston moved quickly to build a beautiful Oriental-style summer home on a small peninsula at the west end of the lake. He knew that the additional height of the Eastwood Dam would turn the peninsula into an island. The home still stands today on what has since become known as Treasure Island. 11 years after the completion of the Eastwood Dam, the bridge was added. San Bernardino had requested an easement across the top of the dam for a new road along the south shore into the village. The bridge and the new road cut travel time into Big Bear Village by almost an hour. With the newly constructed dam at Bear Valley, Redlands farmers now enjoyed an abundant supply of water. San Bernardino City engineer Adolph H. Kobig needed reservoirs that could supply water to San Bernardino. In 1890, he designed a massive plan that required the construction of several dams.
The plan also called for about 60 miles of interconnecting tunnels cut through the mountains to divert the natural flow of water away from the desert and back down to the San Bernardino Valley. The plan was going to be expensive. He traveled back east and found a group of investors in Ohio willing to back him. The name of the new company was the Arrowhead Revision Company, and it was headed by James Gamble of the Procter & Gamble Soap Company as president. Problems with the massive project began almost immediately, with late payments to contractors and right-of-way lawsuits which brought the drilling to a halt time after time. After a year, Kobig grew frustrated with the company and quit the project.
It wasn't until 1904, 11 years later, that construction on the Lake Arrowhead Dam actually began. The design called for a 184-foot-high earth-filled dam with a concrete core wall. 2 steam shovels, 2 locomotives, miles of track, rail dump cars, and tons of concrete were hauled up the steep Waterman Canyon Road to the dam site. By 1908, the unfinished dam had reached a height of 90 feet, and water was allowed to start filling the lake bed. As the water rose, the core wall of the dam started to crack. Construction was halted while repairs to the dam were made. They started filling the lake again after 2 years of repairs. The dam cracked once again. A new engineer by the name of F.E. Trask stepped in and finally solved the problem once and for all. But in 1912, at a height of 160 feet, disaster struck.
It turns out that former San Bernardino City engineer Adolph Kobig, the man who had originally started this project, now posed its greatest threat. After Kobig quit in 1892, he went to Victorville to organize the desert landowners to file an action in court preventing the Arrowhead Reservoir Company from diverting any of the desert watershed to San Bernardino. In 1913, the courts found in favor of the desert landowners. So, after 22 years of hard work and millions of dollars invested, the Arrowhead Reservoir Company had 6.5 miles of tunnel that wouldn't be used and a lake full of water that they couldn't sell.
It was realized at this point that in addition to the lake, they also owned the land around it. And during the last 20 years, vacationing in the San Bernardino Mountains had grown enormously. The land was now worth thousands of times what they'd paid for it. In 1921, the lake and all of its land were sold to a Los Angeles syndicate called the Arrowhead Lake Company. They changed the name from Little Bear Lake to Lake Arrowhead. A massive development program was begun that included constructing a Norman English-style village and raising the height of the dam to 184 feet. This syndicate was well financed and had ambitious plans to turn the lake into the finest mountain resort in Southern California. The company spent over $8 million in the development program. Subdivisions were laid out and lots sold at a record pace. From the wreckage of a failed irrigation project, Lake Arrowhead became a showcase vacation community that attracted some of the most affluent people and celebrities from all over Southern California.